This happened to my great-uncle, Arthur Moreau. He was a composer, well known in his time, back in the mid-20th century. A genius, some said, but also a man prone to fits of melancholic introspection. He'd always been highly sensitive to atmosphere, believing that true creativity sprang from immersion in one's surroundings. After a particularly messy and public separation from his wife, a celebrated ballerina, no less, Arthur found himself utterly blocked. The music simply wouldn't come. It was in this state of creative despair that he sought refuge in the Swiss Alps. He told his few remaining friends he needed absolute solitude, a place where the grandeur of nature could either break him completely or spark something new. He found a place called the Glacier's Edge Lodge, an old, seemingly forgotten establishment nestled deep in a secluded valley, accessible only by a winding, narrow road that was often impassable in winter. When he arrived in late autumn, the first snows were already falling. He remembered the lodge manager, a man named Herr Richter, distinctively. Richter was thin, almost skeletal, with a polite but unsettlingly fixed smile and eyes that reminded Arthur of chipped ice. He'd informed my great-uncle with a peculiar emphasis that Arthur was to be the only guest for the foreseeable future. The implication was that the lodge was usually bustling, but for some reason, this season, it was quiet. Arthur, seeking solitude, didn't question it. The lodge itself was magnificent in a severe way. Dark, ancient wood, cavernous ceilings, and enormous windows framing a stark, pristine landscape of snow-dusted peaks. But there was a coldness to it, beyond the obvious chill of the Alps, that Arthur couldn't quite place. The small staff, mostly young men and women with strikingly pale complexions, and an almost unnerving uniformity in their movements, seemed to glide rather than walk. They rarely spoke unless spoken to, and when they did, their voices were soft, almost hushed. Arthur often observed them, noticing they never shivered despite the biting drafts, and their composure was absolute, their smiles thin and unchanging. He always found it odd, he later wrote in his journals, that they never seemed to truly relax, even when off duty. Days folded into weeks, each one a stark white canvas of silence. The only sounds were the persistent, sighing wind that whistled through the mountain crevices, and, more disturbingly, faint, discordant piano notes. These notes would drift from some unseen part of the lodge, usually in the dead of night. Arthur, a man who lived and breathed harmony, found them jarring yet strangely compelling. He described them as music of the abyss, notes that seemed to defy conventional scales, carrying a profound, cold beauty. He tried to compose, to force the melodies out. He'd sit at the grand piano in the lodge's common room, his fingers hovering, but the sounds that emerged were strained, dissonant echoes of his internal turmoil. The sheer, oppressive silence of the mountain pressed in on him, a heavy, suffocating blanket. Then, gradually, insidiously, the strange notes began to infiltrate his own work. He started writing, first in a frenzy, then with a detached, almost automatic precision. The music poured from him, dark, primal, laced with an eerie, rhythmic hum that seemed to mimic the very pulse of the mountain itself. It was unlike anything he had ever conceived, terrifyingly beautiful, a symphony of bleak desolation. He called it, in his journal, the Glacier's Requiem. He also began to notice other unsettling details about the staff. They never seemed to sleep. He'd often see them, at all hours, simply standing by the windows, gazing out at the endless snow, their breaths never fogging the glass. Their complexions grew even paler, taking on a translucent quality, and their eyes, once merely expressionless, now held a deep, unblinking stillness that made his own heart race whenever he met their gaze. It was as if they were slowly becoming part of the landscape itself. One particularly cold night, Arthur was jolted awake by the unmistakable sound of his own Glacier's Requiem resonating through the lodge. But it wasn't a recording, and it wasn't being played by him. It was emanating from the grand hall, amplified, echoing, but with a new, horrifying layer. A chorus of low, guttural moans pulsed beneath the music, growing louder, more insistent, a sound that seemed to vibrate in his very bones. A cold dread gripping him, he stumbled from his cabin. As he neared the grand hall, the sound became overwhelming, a physical pressure. He pushed open the heavy wooden doors. The sight that greeted him, he would recount later, froze the blood in his veins. The hall was bathed in an ethereal blue-white light, cast by the moon on the snow through the vast windows. Standing in the center, arranged in a chilling semicircle, were the staff. Their faces were ashen, their eyes glowing with that same unblinking stillness. But they were not alone. Beyond them, pressing against the glass, were dozens, possibly hundreds, of figures. They were cloaked in ice and snow, their limbs skeletal, their faces gaunt and expressionless. And from their gaping mouths came the guttural moans, the chilling bass line to his own horrifying symphony. These were the source of the whispers in the wind, the discordant piano notes, the very essence of the mountain's cold, ancient song. And now they had their chorus. The staff, their eyes fixed on Arthur, began to sway, their movements slow and unnatural, beckoning him forward. He saw Herr Richter, his thin lips stretched into that too-wide smile, his hand extending, inviting Arthur to join their eternal frozen concert. What happened next is a blur in Arthur's accounts. He said he felt an overwhelming urge to run, but also a strange, terrible pull to join them, to immerse himself fully in the ultimate silence. He remembered screaming, a sound that seemed swallowed by the cold. He remembered the feeling of ice on his skin, then a searing pain. He was found hours later, collapsed just outside the lodge's perimeter, half buried in a snowdrift. He had severe frostbite and was delirious. The local authorities, alerted by a rare passing snowplow driver who noticed the lodge's lights were on, but the road clear of recent tracks, assumed he had wandered out in a fit of delusion. When he was rescued, the lodge was locked and deserted. No sign of Herr Richter or his staff. No trace of the strange, pale figures. The local police put it down to Arthur's fragile mental state and the harsh conditions. But Arthur never saw it that way. He never composed another note. He spent the rest of his life in a small cottage, always cold, always wrapped in blankets, his eyes holding a distant, unblinking stillness that reminded some of the Alps themselves. He would only ever whisper about the glacier's requiem and the chorus that awaited him, forever, in the alpine silence. This story, or at least the bones of it, comes from my cousin, Sarah. She's still recovering, still has nightmares, and honestly, I don't think she'll ever look at a beach vacation the same way again. This happened about 2 years ago, right around when things were opening up again after the big pandemic lockdowns. Sarah and her 4 closest friends, Lisa, Mark, Chloe, and Ben, decided to celebrate their collective 30th birthdays with a trip of a lifetime. They'd booked this place called Kaimana Sanctuary, an exclusive off-grid eco-resort on a supposedly untouched island somewhere in the South Pacific. The website promised pristine beaches, lush, untouched jungles, and a complete digital detox. No Wi-Fi, no cell signal, just pure, unadulterated nature and self-sustaining luxury. It sounded idyllic, a perfect escape from the grind, exactly what 5 burnt-out millennials needed. From the moment they landed on the tiny airstrip, just a cleared patch of land really, and were met by the resort staff, things felt different. Not bad, just different. The air was thick and humid, but the staff, dressed in simple linen uniforms, seemed utterly unfazed. No sweat, no hurried movements. They moved with a kind of synchronized grace, their smiles wide and unwavering, even as they loaded heavy bags onto a traditional outrigger canoe. The resort owner, a woman named Anya, greeted them personally. She was stunning, with sharp features and an unnervingly calm demeanor, her eyes holding a depth that seemed to see right through them. The first few days at Kaimana were, on the surface, everything they had hoped for. The bungalows were beautiful, open to the sea breeze, built from natural materials. The food, served in a communal dining pavilion, was fresh, delicious, and unlike anything they'd ever tasted. Exotic fruits, strange, succulent fish. They spent their days snorkeling in crystal-clear waters, hiking through dense jungle trails, and sharing laughter under star-dusted skies. No phones meant real conversations, real connection. It was almost perfect. But then Sarah, who has always been prone to anxiety, started noticing things. Little things at first. She realized the staff never seemed to sleep. No matter how early she woke for a sunrise swim or how late she stayed up talking, there was always someone, perfectly composed, silently tending to the grounds or preparing the next meal. And the silence. Not just the absence of digital noise, but an almost unnatural quiet in the jungle at night. No buzzing insects, no chirping frogs, and sometimes, especially near the resort's private shaded cove, she'd catch a faint metallic tang in the air, like old blood mixed with something sweet and earthy. Lisa, ever the practical one, scoffed at Sarah's concerns. "It's a remote island, Sarah. Things are different here. And honestly, it's paradise. You're just detoxing a little too hard." The turning point came on day 5. Mark, who had always been the most adventurous, decided to try a solo jungle trek to a supposedly hidden waterfall that Anya had vaguely mentioned. He left early, full of excitement, promising to be back by lunch. Lunch came and went. Then dinner. No Mark. Anya was informed. She listened, her calm demeanor never wavering, not a flicker of concern in her eyes. "Ah, Mark," she said, with that unsettlingly serene smile. "It happens sometimes. Guests lose themselves in the island's beauty. The jungle has a way of embracing you. He will return when he is ready." The friends were horrified. "What do you mean, lose themselves?" Chloe demanded, her voice tight with panic. "Shouldn't we send a search party? He could be hurt." Anya simply inclined her head. "Our island is protected. He is safe. The path to true self-discovery is often winding." Despite Anya's assurances, they demanded to search. Anya assigned a few staff members to accompany them, their movements still uncannily synchronized, their faces unreadable. They trekked for hours, calling Mark's name. It was during this search that the idyllic facade of Kaimana Sanctuary began to crack. Deep within a particularly dense part of the jungle, hidden behind a curtain of hanging vines, they stumbled upon something utterly horrifying. It wasn't the hidden waterfall. It was a clearing, littered with unsettling ancient carvings on fallen logs and smooth river stones. They depicted figures, strangely elongated, almost liquid in form, intertwined with the roots of trees. And in the center, a crude stone altar. Around it, the metallic tang was overwhelming, sickly sweet. There were fresh, dried leaves, burnt offerings, and disturbing dark stains on the stone. It looked less like a wellness retreat and more like a ritual site. Chloe, usually the most composed, started to hyperventilate. Ben, who had always been a skeptic, stared at the altar, his face ashen. The accompanying staff members stood utterly still, their blank smiles fixed, their eyes watching the friends with an unnerving intensity. They didn't offer comfort or explanation, just silent, patient observation. That night, back at the lodge, the friends huddled together, whispering. The digital detox had become a terrifying isolation. Their phones were useless bricks. The canoes were tied down and the airstrip was miles away. They were trapped. They tried to confront Anya, but she was simply gone, replaced by one of the silent staff members who informed them, in that strangely hushed voice, that Anya was communing with the island. Panic set in. They tried to steal a canoe, but found them chained. They tried to hike out, but the jungle, once inviting, now felt oppressive, labyrinthine. Every path they took seemed to lead them in circles, back towards the ominous clearing. The staff, wherever they turned, seemed to appear from nowhere, always just out of reach, their silent presence a constant chilling reminder that they were being watched. The next morning, Lisa, who had seemed the most shaken by Mark's disappearance, was found sitting by the beach, staring out at the ocean. She looked different. Her eyes, once so lively, were now wide and vacant, mirroring the serene stillness of the staff. A thin, dark line of fluid trailed from the corner of her mouth. When Sarah reached out, Lisa just smiled, that same too wide, too still smile, and whispered, "The island embraces. It's so peaceful." Her skin felt unnaturally cold, despite the tropical heat. They never found Mark, and they never saw Lisa again after that morning. Sarah, Ben, and Chloe barely made it off that island alive. A stray fishing boat, driven far off course by a sudden squall, spotted their desperate signals days later. They were dehydrated, terrified, and on the brink of collapse. The official story, when they were finally back in civilization and debriefed by authorities, was that the Kaimana sanctuary had been abandoned, a fraudulent ecotourism venture that ran into financial trouble. They found no trace of Anya or her staff, no evidence of the elaborate ritual site, just a deserted, overgrown resort. Lisa and Mark were listed as missing, presumed lost at sea or in the jungle. But Sarah knows what she saw. She knows what losing themselves truly meant. She saw the vacant eyes, the unnaturally cold skin, the horrifying stillness of those who had allowed the island and whatever inhabited it to fully embrace them. She can still feel the heavy, silent presence of the staff and taste that metallic tang in the humid air, a taste that whispers of a darker, more ancient form of sustenance than anything on a resort menu. She got out, but she'll tell you, a part of her friends, and perhaps a part of her own soul, was left behind, permanently embraced by the silent horror of that island. This account, or at least the fragments I've been able to piece together, comes from Dr. Evelyn Reed. Not the famous Dr. Reed you might have seen on daytime TV a few years back, the one who wrote all those bestsellers about finding your inner peace. No, that Dr. Reed disappeared. This is about what happened to her, or what she insisted happened, before she vanished. Evelyn, my aunt, was a brilliant woman, but after a particularly nasty public scandal, a patient lawsuit that spiraled into a media frenzy, she was utterly ruined. Her practice crumbled, her book deals evaporated, and her reputation was in tatters. She became a recluse, haunted by the very public persona she had meticulously crafted. It was in this state of profound despair that she received an anonymous, elegantly printed brochure for a place called Aura Sanctuary. It promised complete anonymity, profound healing, and a reconnection with one's true self in an environment of unparalleled luxury. The location was deep in the Nevada desert, miles from anything, accessible only by a private, unpaved road. No cell service, no internet, just the vast, silent expanse of sand and sky. For Evelyn, it sounded like salvation. She arrived in the scorching late summer, the heat shimmering off the barren landscape. The resort itself was a collection of sleek, minimalist structures blending seamlessly with the desert, all glass and polished stone. The director, a woman named Lena, greeted her. Lena had an almost unnervingly bright, calm gaze that seemed to penetrate Evelyn's every defense. Her movements were fluid, unhurried, and even in the oppressive desert heat, she never seemed to break a sweat. She spoke in soft, hypnotic tones, emphasizing the sanctuary's unique, individualized therapies. The other guests were few, and like Evelyn, seemed to be high-profile individuals seeking extreme discretion after their own public downfalls. They were all undergoing what Lena described as deep core spiritual alignment sessions. Evelyn's own therapy began almost immediately. Lena's questions were probing, not just about Evelyn's scandal, but about her deepest fears, her hidden regrets, her sense of self-worth. It was intense, almost intrusive, yet delivered with such serene compassion that Evelyn found herself divulging things she'd never confessed to anyone. As the days passed, Evelyn noticed a strange lethargy settling over the other guests. Their faces, once etched with the stress of public life, began to look gaunt, almost translucent, as if something vital was slowly being drained from them. Their eyes, once darting and anxious, grew glazed, holding a distant, almost beatific contentment. Yet when she spoke to them, they all echoed Lena's phrases, speaking of profound peace, of having shed their burdens, of finally seeing clearly. They looked physically diminished, but spoke with an ethereal calm that sent a shiver down Evelyn's spine despite the heat. The desert nights, which should have been alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures, were unnervingly silent. Too silent. It was in this silence that Evelyn began to hear them. Faint, almost imperceptible whispers carried on the dry, hot wind. They were not words, not precisely, but a constant, gentle urging. Empty, release, shed. They seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere, seeping into her dreams, nudging her towards a complete surrender. One evening, after a particularly draining session with Lena, Evelyn sat by her window, staring out at the vast, unchanging desert. The whispers were louder now, clearer. You are almost free. Of yourself. And suddenly it clicked. Lena's reconnection wasn't about finding a better self or a truer self. It was about emptying the self, draining it, making space for something else. The contentment she saw in the other guests wasn't peace. It was the vacant bliss of the utterly consumed. Their pale skin, their unblinking eyes, their almost breathless calm. They were being hollowed out, their essence becoming part of the desert, or perhaps part of Lena. Panic, cold and sharp, cut through Evelyn's carefully constructed composure. She had to get out. But the isolation was absolute. Her phone was dead, no power to charge it. The resort vehicle that brought her there was gone. The desert stretched endlessly, a shimmering, indifferent trap. She tried to wake the other guests, but they only offered those placid, empty smiles, muttering about finding their true void. Lena, when Evelyn desperately confronted her, simply smiled that serene, unnerving smile. The desert requires a certain sacrifice, Doctor. Read, she murmured, her bright eyes fixed on Evelyn. To be truly free, one must first be truly empty. What happened next is still unclear. Evelyn always insisted she fled, running through the desert under a moonless sky, the whispers chasing her, the vastness of the land trying to swallow her whole. She remembered the staff, motionless, watching her go from the resort, like statues carved from the desert itself, their faces devoid of concern or even pursuit. She described finding an old, dusty service road, stumbling along it for what felt like days, until a lone, weary truck driver found her, delirious and near death, miles from any known settlement. The official explanation was heat stroke, severe dehydration, and a breakdown due to her recent trauma. When authorities investigated Aura Sanctuary, they found it abandoned, just as it had been marketed. Off-grid, no permanent staff, no traces of the other guests. Lena and her therapies simply vanished. But Evelyn, for the rest of her life, was never quite the same. She never returned to her practice. She spoke in hushed tones, often staring blankly into space, as if still listening to the whispers of the desert. She kept warm, even in summer, bundling up, and would often press her hands to her chest, as if trying to keep something from escaping. She believed the desert, or Lena, or whatever entity Lena served, had tried to take her, to empty her out. And sometimes, in her most lucid moments, she'd look at you with eyes that held a new, frightening depth. Too calm, too bright, and you couldn't help but wonder if a piece of her, or perhaps something else, had indeed been left behind, forever thirsty in the vast, silent embrace of the desert.